The moment Martha Harper stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the blazing summer of 1878, the dust hit her like a fist, and the town looked at her like it had never seen a woman travel alone, which, judging by the stares she collected from the men lounging outside the Silver Creek saloon, it very nearly hadn't. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned tightly beneath a bonnet that had seen better days, and eyes the color of river water in autumn, greenish-gray and restless and deep. She wore a practical dress of faded brown calico, carried a single leather traveling bag that had belonged to her father before he died, and held in her gloved hand a folded letter that she had read so many times the creases had worn nearly through. The letter was from a man named Deputy Connors out of Comanche County, and it said, in the blunt economy of frontier correspondence, that her brother Thomas Harper had died in a cattle dispute some 6 months prior and had been buried somewhere in the grasslands south of the Cimarron River, though the exact location was not well documented. That was what the letter said. Somewhere. Not well documented. Martha had read those words in her small room above her employer's laundry in Wichita and felt the floor tilt beneath her. Thomas was her only living family. Their parents had died within a year of each other, their mother of fever in 1874, their father of grief shortly after, and Thomas had gone west to make his fortune, as young men did in those years, full of hope and the particular recklessness of people who have nothing left to lose. He had written her letters, irregular and short, about cattle drives and open skies, and a land so enormous it made a man feel small in a way that was almost holy. And then the letters had stopped, and then came Deputy Connors's cold little note, and now here she was in Caldwell, Kansas, standing in the July heat with nowhere particular to go and a heart that felt like it had been wrung out and left to dry. She needed someone who knew the land south of town. She needed someone who could take her to where Thomas lay, because she could not bear the idea of him out there in unmarked ground with nobody knowing his name. She needed to see his grave, to put flowers on it, to say the words she hadn't been able to say when the letter came because she had been too stunned to cry, and she needed to do it before the grief permanently calcified inside her chest and made breathing difficult for the rest of her life. The livery stable owner, a round man named Peavy who smelled of horse and tobacco, told her she wanted Elias Sheridan. "He knows every inch of ground between here and the Cimarron," Peavy said, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "Done every kind of work a man can do out here. Scouted for the army, rode cattle drives, trapped. He knows where everything is buried, if you'll pardon the expression." Martha pardoned it. "Where would I find him?" "He's usually at the hotel this time of day, takes his lunch there." Peavy finally looked at her. He's not the most sociable fellow. Don't take it personal if he says no." Martha thanked him and walked across the street to the Caldwell Hotel, which was a 2-story wooden building with a porch that needed painting and a sign that swung in the dry wind. Inside, the dining room was half full with men in dusty clothes eating beans and cornbread, and she found Elias Sheridan almost immediately because he was the only man eating alone who looked like he preferred it that way. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean and weathered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. He wore a plain canvas shirt, worn at the elbows, and a brown leather vest, and his hat sat on the chair beside him like a well-behaved companion. He had a quality of absolute stillness that Martha noticed at once, the kind of stillness that belongs to men who have spent a great deal of time alone in open country, where moving unnecessarily wastes energy and draws attention. He was reading a newspaper which surprised her and eating methodically, and he did not look up when she approached his table. "Mr. Sheridan," she said. He looked up then, and she saw that his eyes were a startling dark brown, almost black, and that they were the kind of eyes that evaluated everything quickly and catalogued it without visible judgment. He studied her for a moment, the travel-worn dress, the tight-held shoulders, the carefully neutral expression that was doing only a partial job of concealing genuine distress, and then he said, "Yes, ma'am. My name is Martha Harper. I've just come in on the stage from Wichita." She stood very straight because she had learned that posture was a kind of armor. "I'm told you know the country south of here, down toward the Cimarron." "I do," he said. "I'm looking for my brother's grave, Thomas Harper. He died 6 months ago somewhere in that country, and I've been told the location wasn't recorded properly." She paused. "I need to find it." "I understand you might be able to help me." Something shifted in his face. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, but she caught it. He set down his fork slowly and folded the newspaper closed. "Thomas Harper," he said. "About 24 years old, reddish hair, built like a post fence." Martha's breath caught. "Yes, that's him. Did you know him?" Elias Sheridan was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to make her palms damp inside her gloves. "I knew him some," he said at last. "And yes, I know where he's buried." He looked at her steadily. "I was there." The dining room continued its clatter and murmur around them, indifferent to the weight that had just settled over that particular table. Martha felt the back of her throat tighten in the particular way that precedes tears, and she pressed her lips together hard and refused them. "Then I'd like to hire you to take me there," she said. "I'll pay what I can. I'm not a wealthy woman, but I'm not without resources." He looked at her for another moment, that unhurried evaluation, and then he said something she hadn't expected. "I'll take you. You don't need to pay me." "Mr. Sheridan, I wasn't asking for charity." "I know you weren't," he said simply. "But Thomas Harper did me a good turn once, and I never got the chance to return it. Taking his sister to his grave seems like it might be a reasonable way to settle accounts." He picked up his fork again. "I'll need a day to get supplies together. We can leave tomorrow morning early. You'll want to find somewhere to stay tonight. The hotel here, I imagine." "Mrs. Aldrich keeps a clean room," he said, with something that was not quite a smile but suggested one might be possible eventually. "She's the woman at the desk." Martha nodded. She was not sure whether to thank him, because the gratitude that was rising in her was much larger than the situation's surface demanded, and releasing it now, in a hotel dining room full of strangers, was not something she was capable of without also releasing everything else. "Tomorrow morning, then," she said. "I'll be ready." 6 o'clock, he said. "Bring a hat that'll actually keep the sun off." She touched the brim of her inadequate bonnet and felt, despite everything, a flicker of something that was not quite amusement. "I'll see what I can arrange." She booked a room and lay awake that night listening to the sounds of the frontier town settling into itself. The distant piano from the saloon, the occasional shout, the slow creak of the building in the Kansas wind, and thought about Thomas. He had been 24 when he died, which was young, but people died young out here with a frequency that the newspapers back east reported with a mix of horror and entertainment. She thought about the last letter he had sent her, from a cattle camp somewhere in Indian Territory, in which he had described a sunset over the grasslands with an eloquence that had surprised her because Thomas had never been a literary man. He had written, "The sky out here goes every color you can name, and then some that don't have names yet, Martha. It's like the world is showing off. I think you'd like it if you ever got out this way. I think it might suit you." She had written back that she would come visit him someday. She had not come in time. In the morning she rose before 5 and dressed and found, downstairs in the general store that shared a wall with the hotel, a wide-brimmed felt hat of the kind the cowboys wore, dark brown and practical, that fit her well enough with a pin to hold it. She bought it without embarrassment. She was not in Kansas to look charming. She was in Kansas to find her brother. Elias Sheridan was waiting outside the livery at 6 o'clock with 2 horses and a pack mule and the composed, unhurried manner of a man who had been awake for hours already. He glanced at the hat when she arrived and said nothing, but that suggestion of a smile was there again at the corner of his mouth, and she found she didn't mind it. "You ride?" he asked. "Adequately," she said, which was the truth. She had grown up in Missouri on a farm that had gone to pieces slowly after her father's illness, and there had been horses. "The bay is gentle," he said. "Her name's Clover. She won't give you trouble." Clover was a sturdy chestnut mare with a kind eye, and Martha liked her immediately. She mounted without difficulty, adjusted her skirts, settled her hat, and looked at Elias Sheridan, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Ready," she said. They rode south out of Caldwell as the sky was still going pink and gold in the east, the town falling behind them and the great grasslands opening ahead. The Kansas prairie in summer was a thing of extraordinary scale, the grass rolling in long waves under the wind, the sky enormous and blue, and inhabited by vast white clouds that moved with stately unhurriedness, and the heat not yet vicious but already present, promising. Martha had not spent much time in open country in recent years, and the sheer size of it was both daunting and, she found, strangely relieving. After Wichita's close streets and small rooms and the daily containment of her grief, there was something in this enormity that felt like permission to breathe. They rode without much conversation for the first hour, which suited Martha and seemed to suit Elias as well. He rode with the ease of someone who had spent more time on horseback than off, and he watched the land around them with a quiet attentiveness that she found reassuring. He knew where he was. That was evident in every direction he chose, every slight adjustment he made to their course across what looked to her like featureless grass. When the sun was fully up and the heat beginning to assert itself, he pulled up at a shallow creek and let the horses drink, and he passed her a canteen and said, "We'll reach the Cimarron country by evening tomorrow if we make good time today." "That far?" "Southwest of here. Your brother was working a ranch down in the territory line country." He refilled the canteen from the creek and capped it. "Good land, some of it. Cattle country." He paused. "How much do you know about how he died?" Martha looked at the water moving over the rocks and said, "The letter I received said it was a cattle dispute. That's all." She looked at him. "You said you were there. Will you tell me what happened?" Elias was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet, not evasively but thinking, choosing words with care. "There was a disagreement over a water hole," he said. "Your brother was working for a smaller outfit, and one of the bigger ranches in the area had decided the water hole belonged to them. There was a confrontation." He paused again. "It wasn't what you'd call a fair fight. Your brother was brave about it. He stood his ground when most men would have backed down." Martha absorbed this. "Was anyone held responsible? In what sense?" "In the legal sense." Elias' expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes were honest. "The law in that country in those years was limited. The bigger ranches had considerable influence. There were inquiries, nothing came of them." Martha nodded slowly. She had suspected something like this. It was the nature of things in the West in those years. The men with cattle and land and money shaped the law around themselves, and the men without were simply unfortunate. It made her angry, a deep and quiet anger that had nowhere particular to go, and she tucked it away beside the grief. "I see," she said. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's not a sufficient thing to say, I know." "No," she agreed, "but it's what there is to say." They rode on, and as the day progressed, the silence between them changed character. The early silence had been the silence of strangers. This was something different, more companionable, less careful, the silence of two people who are beginning to understand that they can be quiet near each other without it being uncomfortable. Martha found herself noticing things about Elias Sheridan. The way he moved through the landscape as if it were a place he genuinely belonged rather than merely traversed. The economy of his movements, nothing wasted, nothing performed. The occasional small gesture that revealed more attentiveness to her comfort than his manner suggested, pointing out a stretch of rough ground before she reached it, slowing his pace when the heat was worst, producing, mid-afternoon, a wax paper packet of dried apricots and hard biscuits from his saddlebag, and offering them over without comment, as if the provision of food were the most natural thing in the world. "How did you know Thomas?" she asked, around a mouthful of biscuit. Elias looked at the horizon. We crossed paths on a cattle drive in '76, the Kishom Trail up from Texas. He was young and green and got himself into a situation in Abilene involving a card game and some men who were not friendly about losing. He was quiet for a beat. I helped him out of it. You fought for him. I talked, he said. Mostly. A little physical persuasion was eventually necessary, that corner-mouth suggestion again. He was grateful. We rode together for a stretch afterward before the trail split. He was good company. Enthusiastic about everything, even the things that were miserable, he paused. He talked about you. Martha felt something press against the inside of her sternum. What did he say? He said you were the sensible one in the family. Said you kept the farm running after your father got sick, that you were tougher than anyone gave you credit for. A brief pause, and his voice was quieter when he continued. He said he was going to make enough money to bring you out west, set you up properly somewhere with a house and land and a proper life. He glanced at her. He was very certain about it. Martha looked away at the grass bending in the wind and pressed her lips together and did not cry, but it was a very close thing. He was always certain about things, she said, when she trusted her voice. It was one of his best qualities and one of his most dangerous ones. Yes, said Elias. I noticed that. They made camp that evening beside a grove of cottonwoods near a shallow pond, and Elias built a fire with the competent efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times. And he cooked beans and salt pork in a cast iron pan, and they ate by firelight, while the stars came out above the Kansas grasslands in numbers that city people never quite believed. Martha sat across the fire from him with her tin plate and looked up and thought she understood now what Thomas had meant about colors that didn't have names. The sky wasn't black so much as a deep, living darkness populated by light, and the fire's glow made the cottonwood leaves amber, and the whole world felt simultaneously enormous, and in some way she couldn't entirely account for safe. Do you live in Caldwell? She asked. Elias refilled his coffee cup from the pot on the fire's edge. More or less. I keep a room at the hotel and use the livery stable for my horses. I take work where I find it. He looked at the fire. I've been thinking about settling down somewhere permanent, haven't quite decided where. What kind of work do you do now? Scouting mostly. For cattle outfits, sometimes for settlers who need to find water or roots. Occasional work for the railroad. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. It's good work. I like the movement of it, but he stopped. But Martha pressed gently. He looked at her across the fire and she saw something in his expression that was difficult to categorize, a kind of considered honesty, the expression of a man deciding to tell the truth rather than a comfortable partial version of it. But it gets lonesome, he said simply. After a while. Martha understood that completely. She had been lonesome in Wichita in a way that was separate from the grief for Thomas, a loneliness that had predated his death and was something to do with the smallness of her daily life and the absence of anyone who truly knew her. Yes, she said, I understand that. What will you do, he asked, after this, after you've found what you came for? She considered the question honestly because she owed it the honesty he had given her. I don't entirely know, she admitted. I have a job in Wichita. It's not a bad job, laundry work, steady pay, but I'm not certain I want to go back. She looked at the fire. Thomas thought I should come west. He may have been right. I'm just not sure what the West looks like for a woman without family connections or considerable means. It looks like hard work and a great deal of sky, he said. I'm not afraid of hard work, she said, and I find I don't mind the sky. He smiled then, a full and genuine smile that changed his face entirely, and Martha felt something warm and entirely involuntary move through her. She looked back at the fire quickly and concentrated on her beans. They slept on either side of the fire, wrapped in bedrolls, with the prairie sounds around them, crickets, the distant call of something she didn't recognize, the horses moving quietly in the dark, and Martha lay looking up at the stars for a long time before sleep came, turning over the day in her mind. She thought about Elias Sheridan's voice when he'd said that Thomas talked about her, and the particular quality of honesty he brought to everything he said, as if dissembling simply wasn't worth the energy. She thought about his hands on the horse's reins, capable, easy, the hands of someone utterly at home in the world he inhabited. She thought about the way he had said it gets lonesome after a while, and the stripped-back simplicity of it, the absence of any performance of toughness or indifference. She told herself firmly that she was not the kind of woman to develop sentimental feelings about a man she had met 24 hours earlier and had hired, or rather, had accepted help from, since he had refused payment on the basis of a mutual connection to her dead brother. She told herself this several times, with diminishing conviction. In the morning they rode out before sunrise again, the sky ahead of them going through its colors, and Elias pointed out things as they traveled, a hawk circling on a thermal, the prints of a deer near a water crossing, the distant line of the Cimarron River appearing through heat shimmer in the afternoon. He was not a talkative man, but he was not a silent one either. He talked when he had something to say, and what he said was worth hearing. He told her about the land they were crossing with the quiet enthusiasm of genuine knowledge. He explained how the cattle drives had transformed this country over the past decade, the great herds moving north from Texas, the way the railroad had changed everything, the way the buffalo that had covered these plains in numbers beyond imagining were now nearly gone, and what that meant for the land, and for the people who had lived here first. The Cheyenne and the Arapaho ranged through here, he said, as they rode along the Cimarron's bank, before the army pushed them onto the reservations. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it, a carefully contained anger not unlike what Martha had felt when he described Thomas's death, and she recognized it as the anger of someone who has seen injustice at close range and learned that outrage doesn't change it. "You sound as though you knew them," she said. "I scouted for the army for 2 years, he said. After that, I couldn't." He said it plainly, without elaboration, and Martha did not push further, but she noted it and added it to her understanding of him. A man who had served a system and found he could not square it with his conscience, and had walked away. They crossed the Cimarron at a shallow ford that afternoon, the water cold and clear around the horse's legs, and on the south bank Elias began to pay a different kind of attention to the landscape, studying it with the careful focus of a man finding his bearings. He led them southwest along the river for a time, then turned south across rolling ground toward a low rise crowned with a single massive cottonwood that stood alone like a landmark. "There," he said, and his voice was different, quieter. Martha's hands tightened on the reins. Clover felt it and tossed her head gently, and Martha loosened her grip. "How close?" "10 minutes." They rode those 10 minutes without speaking, and Martha used them to say the things in her heart she hadn't managed to say since the letter came. The grief for Thomas, the anger, the helpless love for her irritating, reckless, beautiful little brother who had gone west to make a fortune and had died beside a waterhole with nobody but strangers around him. She said those things silently and completely, and by the time Elias stopped the horses at the foot of the rise, she had gotten through enough of it that she thought she could stand upright. It was a simple grave, as graves out here were, a mound of earth marked by a wooden cross made from fence posts, with Thomas's name carved into the horizontal piece in unsteady letters. Someone had taken care with it. The carving was deliberate, each letter distinct. Martha dismounted and walked to it and stood there for a long time. She became aware, distantly, that Elias had dismounted too, but had not followed her. He had stopped some distance back, holding both sets of reins, giving her the space to be alone with her brother. She was grateful for that, and she turned and looked at him briefly and saw him standing with his hat in his hand, his dark head bowed slightly, and the sight of it, this rough, solitary man who had ridden 2 days to keep a debt to a young man who was already gone, hit her somewhere directly behind the ribs. She turned back to the grave and talked to Thomas for a while, out loud, quietly, which she would not have done with anyone standing near enough to hear. She told him she was angry at him for being careless, and she was angry at the men who had done this, and she was angry at a territory where the law was available to purchase like any other commodity. She told him about the letter arriving and the floor tilting. She told him about the stagecoach ride in Caldwell and the hat she had bought to stop Elias Sheridan from smiling his almost smile at her inadequate bonnet, which she immediately regretted mentioning because it seemed undignified for a graveside conversation. She told him she was glad someone had carved his name properly. She told him she loved him and that she was sorry she hadn't come sooner and that she was going to be all right, even though that last thing was partly a promise and partly a decision. She placed on the grave the small bundle of wildflowers she had gathered that morning along the river, yellow and purple and white, small tough flowers of the Kansas summer. And she stood for another moment, and then she said goodbye. When she walked back to where Elias was standing, he looked at her face and didn't say anything that would require her to respond, which was exactly right. He simply handed her Clover's reins and walked ahead to give her another moment. And Martha was so grateful for his continued and instinctive understanding of what she needed that she had to breathe very deliberately for several seconds before she mounted. They rode back toward the river and made camp in a grove of elms on the north bank, and that evening was different from the first. The necessary thing had been done. There was a kind of spaciousness in the aftermath, not happiness exactly, but the particular relief of completed grief, of a thing attended to, of an obligation to the dead at least partially met. Martha felt lighter, as if some ballast had shifted. She sat by the fire with her second cup of coffee and looked at Elias across the flames and felt clearly and with some surprise that she did not want this to end. "You carved his name," she said. "The cross." He looked up from the fire. "I was there when they buried him. The men he worked with were decent enough. One of them made the cross, I carved the name. Then it was you." She looked at him. "You stayed to make sure he had a name on his grave. It seemed important." "It was," she said. "It is." She paused. "Thank you, Mr. Sheridan. That's a very insufficient thing to say, but I mean it with every part of it." "Elias," he said, "after 2 days I think we can manage that." "Martha," she responded, and he nodded once. There was a shift after that, a warming of the already warm silence between them, as if the exchange of names was an acknowledgement of something. Martha noticed that the fire looked a little lower than the evening before, which meant they were sitting closer without having consciously arranged it. She noticed that Elias Sheridan, when not eating or riding or giving directions, had a habit of sitting with his forearms on his knees and watching the fire with that quality of focused stillness, and that she had begun to find this quality deeply attractive rather than merely noticeable. She noticed that he glanced at her more often than was strictly conversational, and that the glances lingered fractionally. She was not the kind of woman who ignored what was in front of her. She was practical. She believed in facts. The fact was that she found Elias Sheridan the most genuinely compelling man she had ever encountered, not for any single quality but for all of them together. The competence and the honesty and the quiet anger at injustice and the smile that had to earn its way out and the hands on the reins and the carved name on her brother's grave. "Tell me about Missouri," he said. She looked at him in mild surprise. "What about it?" "Thomas said you grew up on a farm. I've never been east of the Kansas line." So she told him about Missouri, about the farm outside of Joplin where she and Thomas had grown up with their parents. The fields of corn and tobacco, the creek that froze in winter and ran cold and fast in spring, the particular quality of Missouri summer which was nothing like Kansas summer, being green and humid and smelling of earth and growing things. She told him about her parents without sentimentality but with the steady warmth of genuine love, and she told him about Thomas as a boy, how he had been afraid of nothing and careful of nothing and full of plans that changed every season, wanting to be a farmer and then a soldier and then a fur trapper and then a cowboy, and how he had, in the end, become the last thing on the list. Elias listened with full attention, asking occasional questions that showed he was genuinely curious rather than politely responsive, and Martha had the sensation she occasionally had in very good conversations of a door opening, the feeling that she was talking to someone who was interested in the actual content of what she was saying, not merely in the sound of her voice or the social pleasantness of mutual exchange. "What did you want to be?" he asked. "When you were growing up?" She thought about it honestly. "A teacher," she said. "I loved books. I wanted to teach other people to love them too." She looked at the fire. "Then the farm needed managing and my father needed caring for, and there wasn't a way to pursue that. Life takes you where it takes you." "Is it too late?" he asked. She looked at him. "What? To teach? Are you too old for it to be a possibility?" Nobody had asked her that. In the 5 years since she had given up the idea, not one person had suggested that it might still be possible, and the question landed on her with the force of something she had been waiting to hear without knowing she was waiting. She felt something crack open slightly in her chest, a clean break, not painful. "I don't know," she said, a little wonderingly. "I've never thought of it as still possible." "It seems to me," said Elias carefully, "that a woman who can travel alone across Kansas to find her brother's grave in country she doesn't know could probably arrange a great many things that might seem unlikely." Martha looked at him for a long moment and said nothing, because there wasn't anything to say that was sufficient, and she had learned that sufficiency was something Elias Sheridan valued. On the third day they turned north toward Caldwell, and the journey back felt entirely different from the journey south. The grief was still present, would always be present, she supposed, in its proper proportions, but it was grief that had found its place rather than grief looking for one. The land felt different, or rather she felt differently about the land. The enormous sky that had been daunting on the ride south now felt like Thomas's sky, the one he had written her about, the one that went every color you could name and then some. They talked more freely on the return journey about everything, it seemed, the way conversations go when two people find themselves genuinely interested in each other's minds. She learned that Elias had grown up in Tennessee, the son of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had been a seamstress, that he had come west at 18 after the war's aftermath had gutted the Southern economy and left young men without options. He had scouted for the army and felt the moral impossibility of it and left. He had ridden cattle and learned the land and become, in the years since, someone who belonged to the West in a way that was bone-deep and true. He had never married. He said this in the context of the settlement question, the wondering where to put down roots conversation, and he said it matter-of-factly, as a relevant piece of logistical information, not as an invitation to sympathy. "A man in the kind of work I've done doesn't have much to offer a woman in the way of stability," he said. "It never seemed fair to ask." "That seems like a decision you've made on someone else's behalf without consulting them," Martha said, and then immediately felt she had been too direct. But he didn't look offended. He looked at her with an expression that was measuring and alive and slightly arrested, as if she had said something unexpected that required a revision of some assumption. "Perhaps," he said after a beat. They stopped that afternoon to water the horses at the same creek they had used on the way south. And while the horses drank, Martha sat on a large flat rock at the water's edge and took off her hat and tilted her face up to the sky. The heat was considerable, but there was a breeze along the creek that made it bearable, and the water was lovely clear and quick over brown stones, making the particular sound that running water makes, which she had always found comforting. She was aware of Elias sitting on a rock somewhat near her, and she was aware that he was looking at her, and she chose to let him. After a moment he said, "What are you thinking?" "That this is a beautiful place," she said, without opening her eyes. "That Thomas was right about the sky," a pause, "that I don't particularly want to go back to Wichita." Silence. "Then, you don't have to." She opened her eyes and looked at him. He was sitting with his arms on his knees, watching her, and his expression had that quality of careful honesty she had come to recognize and trust. "I know that logically," she said. "It's less clear practically. There are teaching positions," he said with a directness that surprised her, "at the new schoolhouse in Caldwell. I've heard Mrs. Aldrich mention it. The territory's growing and there aren't enough teachers." Martha looked at him steadily. "You've been thinking about this?" He held her gaze. "Some." Her heart was doing something decidedly inconvenient. "Why does it concern you," she said carefully, "where I settle?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was deciding to tell the complete truth. "Because I'd like to know where you are," he said. "If that's a plain enough answer." It was entirely plain enough. It was, in fact, the plainest and most honest and most affecting thing anyone had said to her in recent memory. And Martha Harper, who had crossed Kansas alone at 26 to put wildflowers on her brother's grave in unmarked country, sat on a rock beside a Kansas creek in July of 1878 and felt something that she had long suspected was not available to her open up like a door that had been locked from the inside. "It's a very plain answer," she said. "I appreciate that about you." He smiled, not the almost smile, the real one, the one that changed his whole face, and said nothing, because he had learned, she thought, that she sometimes needed a moment after a true thing was said. They reached Caldwell the next afternoon, coming into town from the south with the dust of 4 days' travel on them, and the horses tired but good. The town looked different to Martha than it had when she arrived, no longer simply a place to pass through, but a place with texture and possibility. She noticed the schoolhouse on the north side of the main street, newly built, the paint still clean. She noticed the width of the main street, the way the town was laid out with permanence rather than improvisation, the sense that Caldwell was becoming something rather than being something temporary. Elias returned the horses to the livery while Martha washed the travel off at the hotel, and then he came and knocked at the door of the dining room where she was eating supper and asked if he might join her, which she found endearing given that they had spent 4 days in each other's constant company. She told him so. He sat down and ordered his own supper and did not seem embarrassed, which she also found endearing. "I'm going to speak to Mrs. Aldrich about the teaching position tomorrow," Martha said over her plate. He looked at her with quiet attention. "You're staying." "I'm investigating the possibility," she said with deliberate primness, and then abandoned it because it was unlike her and he deserved better. "Yes, I'm staying, or I mean to try." "Good," he said simply, and ate his supper. They sat for a long time over coffee after the meal was cleared, and the dining room emptied around them, and the proprietress gave them the long-suffering look of a woman who wanted to close up her establishment, but found the situation at table 6 too interesting to interrupt. Eventually Martha noticed the woman's expression and felt color rise in her face and told Elias she should go upstairs. He rose when she rose, which was the manners of his upbringing showing through the frontier, and he said, "I'll see you tomorrow then." "You will," she said. At the door of the dining room she turned back because something needed to be said that hadn't been said yet. He was still standing by the table, watching her with that dark, attentive gaze, and she said, "Elias, thank you for taking me." "For everything." She paused. "I came here for Thomas and I found more than I was looking for." He said, "So did I." Martha went upstairs with her heart in a state of considerable and pleasant disorder. In the morning she spoke to Mrs. Aldrich, who was indeed aware of the teaching position, and who was furthermore a woman of considerable local influence and social energy, and who seized upon the prospect of an educated woman from Missouri with obvious qualifications and enthusiasm that Martha found slightly overwhelming. By noon she had been introduced to the school board chairman, a sensible man named Garrett who owned the dry goods store, and by mid-afternoon she had been provisionally offered the position pending a brief discussion of her qualifications, which she provided clearly and with confidence. And by the time the sun was going down, she was the new teacher at the Caldwell schoolhouse, starting in September when the school term began. She was, she realized, walking back to the hotel in the early evening light, genuinely happy. It was a startling thing to notice. She had come here in grief, and she was leaving grief's worst chapter behind without abandoning it, which was how grief ought to be resolved, she thought. She was going to stay, and she was going to teach, and she was going to find a way to build the life that Thomas had wanted her to build, the proper life with the house and the land, even if it was going to be on different terms than Thomas had envisioned. She found Elias at the livery, doing something quiet and competent with a piece of tack, and she told him about the teaching position and watched his face and liked very much what she saw there. A genuine and uncomplicated pleasure, the pleasure of a person who is glad for someone else's good news. "That's well done," he said. "I'm going to need to find a room, something more permanent than the hotel." Mrs. Werner on the north side of town rents a room to a schoolteacher as a matter of principle, he said. "She told me once she believes it improves the neighborhood." Martha laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly, and Elias looked at her with an expression that she thought was probably close to the one she was wearing, which was the expression of someone who has found, unexpectedly and completely against any reasonable planning, something they needed. In the weeks that followed, Martha settled into Caldwell with the efficient thoroughness of a practical woman who has made a decision and intends to honor it. She took the room at Mrs. Werner's, which was clean and had a window looking east and cost exactly what she could afford. She spent the August days before the school term preparing her classroom, organizing the primers and slates that had been donated by various townspeople, arranging the desks, writing on the new chalkboard in her clear and practiced hand. The town took to her with the readiness of a frontier community that had been waiting for what she represented, which was stability, education, and the general civilizing pressure of a woman who took things seriously. Elias called on her. There was no other way to put it. He called on her, turning up at the schoolhouse while she was preparing and offering to help move the heavier desks, and turning up at Mrs. Werner's on Sunday afternoons with his hat in his hand and a slightly formal manner that was quite different from his manner on the trail, and that she found utterly charming. He was navigating the unfamiliar territory of courtship in a small frontier town, where everything was public and everything was noticed, with the same careful attentiveness he brought to navigating physical territory, and she appreciated the effort. They took walks in the evenings along the edge of town, where the prairie began and the sky opened up again, and they sat on the hotel porch on Sunday afternoons, which was respectable. They had long conversations about books, because it turned out that the schoolteacher father in Tennessee had left Elias with a genuine love of reading, and they compared opinions on things they had both read and disagreed productively, and agreed with equal energy. One evening in late August, sitting on the hotel porch watching a tremendous sunset work through its colors over the grasslands, Elias said, "I've been offered work in Dodge City, scouting for a cattle outfit going south." Martha felt the sentence land in her chest with more weight than she had expected. "When?" she managed. "They want an answer this week. The drive would go for 2 months, maybe 2 or 3 months. The school term beginning in September." She looked at the sunset and kept her face composed. "It's good work," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Pays well." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with the particular deliberateness of a man about to say the true thing regardless of whether it was comfortable, "I'm not sure I want to take it." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I'm not sure I want to leave Caldwell." He met her eyes. "More precisely, I'm not sure I want to leave you." The sunset was doing something extraordinary, the whole western sky going crimson and gold, the clouds moving through it like slow fire, and the grasslands going amber below, and Caldwell sitting in the middle of it looking like something from a painting. Martha looked at Elias Sheridan and thought with great clarity that she was in love with him, which was not a surprise, had not been a surprise since approximately the second evening by the campfire, but was nonetheless worth acknowledging. "Don't take it," she said. Something in his face changed, loosened, as if he had been holding a breath for a while. "No. There's a great deal of territory between Caldwell and the Cimarron that needs exploring," she said with careful lightness. "I thought perhaps you could show me more of it, on Sundays when I'm not teaching." He smiled the full smile. "I think that's possible to arrange." She took his hand, quite deliberately, and he looked down at their hands and then at her face and said nothing at all, but his expression said a great many things, all of them the right ones. Autumn came to Kansas with a sweep of gold and copper over the grasslands, the mornings crisp and smelling of wood smoke, the sky going a deeper blue than summer had managed. Martha taught school to 22 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she discovered that teaching was everything she had thought it would be, not easy, but deeply right, the sense of genuine vocation properly expressed. She taught reading and arithmetic and writing, and what she called observation, which was the practice of paying close attention to the world and describing it accurately. And the children, many of whom had never been in a schoolroom before, came to it with a hunger that moved her daily. Elias had found steady work near Caldwell work for the railroad survey, and occasional scouting for cattle outfits doing local drives, and was in town more than he had been in the previous years of his peripatetic life. He ate supper at the hotel dining room most evenings, and Martha joined him when her preparations for the next day's lessons were complete, and the proprietress had long since stopped giving them the long-suffering look, and had replaced it with a look of satisfied approval, which was somehow more embarrassing. On a Sunday in October they rode out to the Cimarron country again, just the two of them, with a lunch packed in saddlebags and no particular purpose except the ride. It was a perfect fall day, the sky immense and bright, the grass gone to the pale gold of late season, the cottonwoods along the waterways a burning yellow. They rode to the grove of elms where they had camped on the return journey and ate their lunch by the river, and Martha said she wanted to go to Thomas's grave. It was different this time, not the first raw pilgrimage of grief but a deliberate and quiet visit, more like the visits that people pay to churchyards on spring mornings, a combination of remembrance and gratitude, and the acknowledgement that the people we love do not entirely leave us. The grave was unchanged, the carved name still clear on the cross. Martha had brought wildflowers again, late-season flowers, a little wind-battered, purple and yellow, and she placed them on the mound. She was aware of Elias standing a few paces behind her, close enough to be present, far enough to give her space, as he always seemed to know how to do. She turned to him after a moment and said, "He would have liked you." Elias looked at the grave. "I think I would have liked him too. I did for the time I knew him. He would have been insufferable about it," she said. "He would have said he could take all the credit because he introduced us." "He would have been right," Elias said. Martha looked at him, standing in the afternoon light of an Oklahoma Territory October, beside her brother's grave in the grassland quiet, and she thought about how thoroughly the world had rearranged itself since she had stepped off a stagecoach in July with a letter in her gloved hand and no certainty of anything. "I want to say something," she said. "All right," he said in his careful, attentive way. "I came here for Thomas, which you know, and I told myself when I decided to stay that I was staying for the teaching position, which is true." She looked at him steadily. "But I also stayed because of you, and I thought you should know that clearly, without it requiring anything. I just thought the truth deserved to be stated plainly." Elias looked at her for a long moment with that expression she had come to love best, the one that meant he was choosing to tell the complete truth. "Martha," he said, "I turned down the work in Dodge City. I've turned down 2 other offers since then. I'm not going anywhere." He paused. "I think you know why." "I'd like to hear it said," she said, which was honest of her and she knew it. "Because I'm in love with you," he said. "I expect I have been since about the second day when you said I'd been making decisions on someone else's behalf without consulting them, and you were entirely right, and it was the most clarifying thing anyone had said to me in years." Martha's heart was doing the thing it had been doing reliably since July, the warm, involuntary, inconvenient, wonderful thing, and she stopped trying to compose her expression into something dignified because there was no point. She crossed the few steps between them and Elias' hands came up to her face, gentle and sure, and when he kissed her it was the way everything about him was honest, unhurried, completely present, and exactly right. They were in the shadow of the cottonwood on the rise, with Thomas's name carved into the wood behind them and the grasslands rolling in every direction and the sky doing its nameless colors above, and Martha thought, quite clearly, that Thomas would not mind one bit. The ride back to Caldwell was different from every other ride they had taken. There was a new quality in the air between them, not the tension of things unsaid, but the warmth of things said and received and properly settled. They rode close and talked easily, and Elias took her hand for a stretch where the trail was wide enough to ride abreast, and Martha thought she had never been so comfortable in her life as she was on a horse beside this man on a Kansas autumn afternoon. He asked her, that evening on the hotel porch, with his hat on his knee and the stars coming out in the early dark, if she would consider marrying him. He said it seriously and simply, the way he said everything, and he said he understood it was quick by any conventional measure, and that he would wait as long as she needed, but that he wanted her to know his intentions clearly. Martha considered for a moment, not out of doubt, because there was none worth examining, but out of the genuine and pleasurable exercise of attention that the question deserved. She thought about the life she was building in Caldwell, the schoolroom and the children, and the room at Mrs. Werner's with the east-facing window. She thought about the life that could be built with a man like Elias Sheridan, who was honest and capable and quiet in exactly the right ways, and who had carved her brother's name into a fence-post cross because it seemed important. She thought about Thomas saying she should come west, that it might suit her. Yes, she said, I would consider it favorably. He exhaled a small, controlled sound that told her he had been more nervous than he looked, which she found deeply charming. All right, he said. Next spring, she said, after the school year is finished, I want to complete the term. That seems right, he agreed. She reached over and took his hand, and they sat on the hotel porch until Mrs. Aldrich appeared at the door behind them with a look of such fierce satisfaction that both of them burst into laughter simultaneously, which was the first time they had laughed together at the same thing at the same moment, and Martha thought it boded well. The winter was the coldest Kansas could arrange, deep snows in January and February, ice on the creek, the kind of cold that made the mornings a genuine negotiation between the warmth of the bed and the necessity of the world. Martha taught school through it with dedication and a good stove, and the children came reliably, because many of their homes were less warm than the schoolhouse, and because Martha had created an atmosphere in that classroom that was worth braving the cold for. Elias was frequently around. He had taken on steady work with the Caldwell Township that winter, helping with infrastructure, doing the kind of general useful work that a competent man with practical knowledge of the land and materials could do. He repaired a section of the school roof that had developed a dangerous lean after a particularly heavy snowfall, doing it himself on a cold February morning before school started, and Martha found him up there when she arrived and stood below looking up at him with an expression she didn't bother to hide. You didn't need to do that, she called up. Snow was going to come through, he called back, through a mouthful of nails. Your children would have been wet. She stood below him in the cold and thought that this was the kind of man Elias Sheridan was, the kind who fixed a school roof in February because children would have been wet, the kind who carves names into grave markers because it seems important, the kind who turns down 2 months of good wages because he doesn't want to leave. She was going to marry him in the spring, and it was the most sensible thing she had ever decided. They exchanged letters through February, which was ridiculous given that they saw each other daily, but which had begun on a whim when Elias had left a note on her desk at the school one morning, and she had written back, and had evolved into a genuine correspondence running parallel to and different from their daily conversations, a more deliberate kind of exchange where they said things they hadn't found the right moment to say in person. His letters were precise and thoughtful and occasionally very funny in a dry, quiet way. She kept all of them in a bundle tied with a piece of blue ribbon in the drawer of the nightstand at Mrs. Werner's. In late February, she rode out to Thomas's grave alone for the first time on a clear, cold Saturday, the snow patchy on the ground, the sky a winter blue of extraordinary depth. She went without Elias, not because she needed the distance from him, but because she wanted to feel that she could do it alone, that she was capable of the journey and the visit without support. She was capable of it. She rode out and spent an hour at the grave, talking to Thomas about the winter and the school and the children and the wedding in the spring, and then she rode home and felt completely herself. She told Elias about the visit at supper, and he listened as he always listened, with his full attention, no interruption, and at the end he said, "How was it?" "Good," she said, and meant it fully. "It was good. He's in good country." "Yes," said Elias. "He is." March came in with mud and the smell of thaw and the first tentatives of new grass on the prairie, and Martha began to understand, watching the grasslands return to green, why people loved this place with such violence and conviction. There was something in the scale of it, the democratic enormity, the way the sky offered everyone the same view. It had nothing to do with prettiness. It was not a pretty landscape in the way that the Missouri hills were pretty. It was something more fundamental, a landscape of absolute honest exposure, where things were what they were and nothing more. She thought it suited her. April brought the courthouse at Wichita a letter requesting a marriage license, which Elias rode north to file in person because he was meticulous about doing things properly, and brought back with a look of slightly sheepish satisfaction that made Martha want to kiss him in the middle of the main street, which she did not, quite, though it was a near thing. They married on the first Saturday in May of 1879 in the Caldwell Church, which was a small white building that had been completed only the previous fall and still smelled of fresh-cut lumber. Martha wore a dress of pale blue wool that she and Mrs. Werner had made together over the winter evenings, not elaborate, but fitted properly and made of good material, and it was the most beautiful dress she had ever owned. She wore her hair in a careful arrangement that Mrs. Aldrich had insisted on assisting with, and she carried a small bunch of prairie wildflowers that had just begun to bloom in the warming days, yellow and white, and the first purple of the season. Elias wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers and a jacket that fit him well, and had clearly recently visited a barber, and when he saw her coming down the aisle of the small church toward him, his expression did the thing she loved best, the complete and unguarded thing, the absence of any performance. He looked at her as though she were the only feature of any landscape worth attending to. The ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Mills, a cheerful man who had come to Caldwell the previous autumn, and who seemed to feel that marriage ceremonies were cause for genuine celebration rather than solemn endurance. He managed both the gravity and the joy of it with a skill that Martha appreciated. When Elias said his vows clearly, with that characteristic directness, looking straight at her, she felt every word land precisely where it was aimed. After the ceremony, there was a celebration in the hotel dining room, which the proprietress had been planning since October with barely contained enthusiasm, involving a prodigious amount of food and considerable quantities of apple cider and an improvised fiddle band. The whole town came, or so it seemed, the schoolchildren's parents and the board members and Mrs. Werner and Mrs. Aldrich and Peavy from the livery and half the ranchers from the surrounding country, and Martha danced 3 dances and laughed more than she had in years, and at one point, standing with Elias' arm around her and a cup of cider in her hand, watching the party around them, felt that the world had arranged itself with a particular and improbable generosity. That night they moved into the small house at the edge of town that Elias had been working on since February, a proper house with 4 rooms and a porch and a kitchen garden that he had dug and she had planted, and a bedroom with 2 windows, one facing east and one facing south, which meant light from first morning to late afternoon, which Martha had specified as a requirement, and which Elias had produced. The first night in that house, with the fire going and the spring dark outside and the sounds of the prairie around them, Martha lay with her head on Elias' chest and listened to his heartbeat and thought about the year of it. Wichita and the letter and the stagecoach and the porch and Elias Sheridan eating alone with his newspaper, and the campfire and the grave and the wildflowers, and everything after. She thought about how entirely the world could change, given sufficient grief and sufficient courage and the good luck to find, at exactly the right moment, a person who knows where the things you're looking for are buried and who offers without price to take you there. Elias, he said into the top of her head, I want to go back to Thomas's grave in the summer, bring proper flowers, plant something there maybe, something that'll come back every year. He was quiet for a moment and then said, wild rose maybe, they grow in that country, come back every spring. He paused. That seems right. Yes, she said, it does. She fell asleep listening to his heartbeat and the prairie outside and thought of Thomas's last letter and the sky that went every color you could name and then some that didn't have names yet, and she thought, he was right. It suits me. Summer came to that Kansas house with the full force of the prairie version, enormous heat, enormous sky, enormous thunderstorms that rolled across the grasslands at night like something from the Old Testament, lighting up the clouds from inside, the thunder following in waves. Martha loved the storms. She would stand on the porch and watch them come, and Elias would stand beside her, and they would watch together while the lightning showed them the whole land in intermittent white, and she thought that this was what Thomas had meant about the world showing off. She was, by July, fairly certain she was expecting a child, which she confirmed by the end of the month with the assistance of Mrs. Aldrich, who had midwifing experience and the unshakable confidence of a woman who has seen most things. Martha told Elias on the porch on a Sunday evening, with the summer stars overhead and the distant sound of crickets in the grass, and she watched his face do the thing, the unguarded thing, the complete and real response, which was a silence that stretched several seconds before he said, in a voice that was lower than usual, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I'm very well," she said. He put his arms around her very carefully, as if she might be fragile, which she was not, but she let him because the gesture was about his heart rather than any assessment of her physical resilience, and she understood that. "All right," he said into her hair. "All right then. I'll need to have a conversation with Mr. Garrett about the school term," she said practically into his shoulder. "I imagine I can teach through the winter at least. We'll have to see." "Don't worry about the school term tonight," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not worried," she said. "I'm glad." "So am I," he said. "So am I." They rode out to Thomas's grave that August as planned, with a rosebush carefully dug and wrapped in burlap that Elias had found at a nursery in Wichita on a supply trip, a hardy variety that the nursery owner said was suited to the climate. They planted it at the head of the grave on a warm afternoon, working the dry soil together, and Martha watered it from the canteen and sat back on her heels and looked at the new wood of the cross with her brother's name, the fresh-planted rose settling in at its foot, and the sky overhead doing the full catalog of its capabilities. "There," she said. "That's better." Elias knelt beside her, one knee in the dirt. "He'd appreciate that," he said. Martha reached over and put her hand on his arm. "He'd appreciate all of it," she said. "He'd have been absolutely insufferable about it, but he'd have appreciated it." She was showing by September, and she turned the school term over to a young man named Edwards who had come through Caldwell with teaching qualifications and a desire to settle, with the intention of returning after the baby came. The children were sad about it in the demonstrative way of children, which moved her, and she promised them she would come back, and she meant it. The autumn was beautiful, all of Kansas autumn's particular glory, the grasslands going gold and the cottonwoods burning yellow and the sky doing its deep blue thing. And Martha was healthy and occupied and deeply content. She spent the autumn mornings at her kitchen table with books and correspondence, writing and reading with the pleasure of someone pursuing things that have been deferred too long, and the afternoons in light domestic work and long conversations with Mrs. Werner, who came by twice a week, and Mrs. Aldrich, who came by whenever she had opinions about things, which was frequently. Elias was good company in the evenings, coming in from his day's work and sitting with her by the fire, the two of them reading or talking. The domestic rhythm of it, something that Martha had not previously understood, could be so completely satisfying. There were evenings when she looked up from her book and found him watching her with that expression she loved, and she thought, "This is the life. This, exactly this." He had taken on part ownership of a small operation providing survey and guide services to the railroad and to new settlers coming into the territory, work that suited his skills and kept him near Caldwell rather than ranging far across the prairie for months at a time. He had made that adjustment without drama or apparent sacrifice, and when Martha pointed out that he had changed his way of working, he said simply that the old way had suited a man with nothing to come home to, and that this was a different situation. In November, he hired a young hand named Sam Whitley, a quiet 16-year-old who had come to Caldwell with his family from Missouri and had no particular prospects, and who turned out to have an instinctive feel for the land that reminded Elias of himself at that age. He was teaching the boy the work, and Martha could see the satisfaction it gave him, the transmission of something he valued, and she loved him for it. The baby came in late January of 1880, on a night of wind and cold, in the house with Mrs. Aldrich present and Elias relegated to the kitchen at his own insistence, because he had decided this was the appropriate position for a husband in such circumstances, though he was clearly not still, and later admitted he had worn a groove in the kitchen floor. The baby was a boy, born healthy and loud, with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray-green eyes, and they named him Thomas Elias Sheridan after the two men who had shaped the circumstances of his existence. Martha held her son in the lamplight of that January night and listened to the wind outside and felt the house around her, the solid walls Elias had built, the warmth of the fire, the particular permanence of a place that belonged to people who intended to stay, and thought that she had found what Thomas had wanted her to find and something more, something he hadn't been able to articulate in his letters, because it was too particular and too large for the kind of short notes he wrote. She had found herself, which was different from finding a life, and better because the self was the foundation everything else was built on. In the spring they rode out to the Cimarron again, the three of them, Martha and Elias and small Thomas in his mother's arms, bundled against the April wind, eyes wide and surprised by the size of everything. The wild rose at Thomas's grave had survived the winter and was just beginning to show its first leaves, new green and determined, and Martha thought it was one of the finest things she had ever seen. She held her son up toward the grave's simple cross and said, quietly, "This is your Uncle Thomas. He was brave and careless, and he loved this sky, and you're named for him, and I think you'd have gotten on wonderfully." Elias stood beside her with his hand on her back, steady and warm, and the prairie wind moved through the new grass, and the cottonwood above them was beginning to leaf out, and the sky was doing everything it knew how to do, which was considerable. The years that followed were full years, built with the kind of patient and genuine effort that creates something worth having. Caldwell grew around them more families, more buildings, a proper church, and then a second one, a newspaper, a physician who set up practice in a house on the east side of town. Martha returned to teaching when Thomas was 8 months old and never stopped, becoming in time something of a fixture in the town's life, the teacher that multiple generations of Caldwell children could point to when asked who had given them their start. Elias' guide and survey operation grew steadily, and Sam Whitley grew with it, becoming a genuinely skilled frontiersman, and when he was 20, a full partner in the business. Elias took obvious pride in Sam's development, and Sam reciprocated with a genuine loyalty that made Martha happy to watch. Thomas, at 2 years old, was, as Elias observed with fond resignation, exactly like his namesake, afraid of nothing, careful of nothing, full of plans that changed monthly. He had his mother's eyes and his father's stillness occasionally broken by his own particular energy, and he loved horses with a passion that began early and never diminished. He could ride before he was 4, under Elias' careful supervision, and was a force of cheerful disruption in his mother's classroom when he was old enough to attend it. Their second child, a girl they named Clara Rose, came in the autumn of 1882, and she was different from Thomas in the thorough way that siblings are quieter, more observant, with a gravity that made her seem older than she was and a laugh, when it came, that made the whole room feel warmer. She was her father's daughter in temperament, and Martha watched the two of them together, Elias and his small, serious daughter in the kitchen garden or on the porch at evening with a warmth that never diminished. In the summer of 1883, Elias came home one evening with a look on his face that Martha had learned meant he was thinking something significant. She waited. He sat across from her at the kitchen table after supper, with Thomas and Clara asleep in the quiet of the house around them, and he said he had spoken to a family that was newly arrived in the territory and had found a piece of land southwest of Caldwell along one of the Cimarron's tributaries that he thought they might buy. She looked at him steadily. "Show me." He showed her. They rode out the following Sunday, the 4 of them, Elias on his horse, Martha on Clover, who was still going at 12 with the equine equivalent of dignified authority, Thomas on his own small horse, and Clara in front of her father, and the land was precisely what Elias had described and more. A creek running clear through cottonwoods, good grass, a rise that would put a house above the flood line, hills to the west catching the late sun, space enough for a garden and a small orchard and a barn and room to grow. Martha stood on the rise in the July sun and looked at it and felt the familiar thing, the door-opening thing. "Yes," she said. Elias looked at her. "You're sure? It's a fair distance from town." "I can ride to town," she said. "It's not as though I haven't done it before." She looked at him with the expression she kept for these moments of his unnecessary caution about her, the expression that said she appreciated the consideration and was going to overrule it cheerfully. "I want this land," he smiled the full smile, "then we'll buy it." They bought it that autumn and began building the following spring, and Elias threw himself into the construction with the thoroughness he brought to everything. And Sam Whitley and a dozen men from town contributed Saturdays through the spring and summer of 1884. And by September, there was a house on that rise above the creek that was larger and better built than anything Martha had previously lived in, with a porch facing south and a kitchen with 2 windows and a barn that was, if anything, slightly overdone. They moved in on a September afternoon with all the practical chaos of a family with 2 children, and a dog of disputed origin that Thomas had acquired the previous winter. And that evening, they sat on the new porch and watched the sun go down over the creek, and the cottonwoods, and Martha leaned against Elias' shoulder and thought about the July of 1878, when she had stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell with a letter in her gloved hand and no certainty of anything. And the distance between that moment and this one seemed both infinite and perfectly logical, every step following from the one before it. Thomas, at 4 years old, sat on the porch steps with the dog, narrating the sunset to his sister in the particular proprietary way of children who have decided they understand something and intend to explain it, and Clara sat with the focused seriousness of a 2-year-old listening to a theory she was evaluating critically. "The sky goes every color there is," Thomas told her importantly. "Papa says there are colors that don't have names yet." Martha looked at Elias. Elias looked at Martha. "That's right," Elias said to Thomas quietly. "That's exactly right." Martha took his hand and held it and looked at the sky doing everything it knew how to do over the creek and the cottonwoods and the land that was theirs, and felt the whole shape of her life around her, the grief that had been resolved and the love that had been found in the resolving of it, the children on the porch steps and the man beside her and the rose that came back every spring at a grave south of the Cimarron. And she thought of Thomas and said to him, inwardly and with complete conviction, "You were right. It suits me." The wild rose at Thomas's grave bloomed every spring for years after, a bright and stubborn red against the plain sky, and Martha and Elias made the ride south together each April to see it. They brought the children when they were old enough, Thomas first, and then Clara, and they told them about their uncle, about the cattle drive and the letter and the stagecoach and the man who had come with his hat in his hand to a hotel dining room and offered to take a woman to her brother's grave because he owed a debt to the dead. Thomas, at 7, said this was the best story he had ever heard, and he wanted to hear it again from the beginning. Elias told it, sitting by the fire in the house on the creek rise on a winter evening, with the wind outside and the fire going and Martha's head on his shoulder, and he told it well and truthfully, and with the particular quality of a man who knows that the story he is telling is the story of his whole life, which makes even the hard parts worth telling. Martha listened to her husband tell the story of how they found each other, with her children around her, and the firelight on the walls of the house that had been built for them by men who considered it worth building, and she thought, this is what it is to have everything you need. Not the absence of loss or difficulty, but the presence of something real enough to carry you through both. The presence of a person who tells the truth and knows where things are buried and offers, without price, to take you there. She fell asleep that night to the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods along the creek, with Elias' arm around her and the children breathing in their rooms, and the last thing she thought before sleep came was the name on the cross south of the Cimarron, and the rose coming back every spring, and the truth that some things, once planted in the right ground, come back again and do not need tending, only love and the willingness to return. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.